It was Napoleon Bonaparte who was credited with the important observation that an army marches on its stomach. And indeed, we see numerous instances where the lack of provisions has led to military defeat. But food and bullets by themselves aren't sufficient for modern-day warfare. In fact, there was another resource that was vital for the military in both world wars of the 20th century, and that was fuel. Just as it was naval superiority that was a deciding factor in the Great War of 1914 to 18, air superiority was vital in the second. But warships and aircraft and tanks all need fuel. Without this, any defensive or offensive effort inevitably grinds to a halt. And it was in just this situation that Hitler found himself. The answer was synthetic fuel, usually distilled from coal or lignite known as brown coal. And up until 1943, this was working well, with millions of tons being produced. Lignite was plentiful in Central and Eastern Europe, so synthetic oil plants were established, not just in Germany, but also in Austria, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Hungary. However, in September of 1944, things began to change. The Germans were driven out of the south of Italy to the north, and they abandoned a number of strategic airfields in their retreat. These were promptly taken over by the Allies, with the British around Brindisi and the Americans a little further up the coast around Bari. The value of these was that now more targets in occupied Europe were within the range of the Allied bombers. Not only was it possible to support the Warsaw Uprising, as we showed in Leon's story, and Tito's partisans in Yugoslavia, as featured in Marcel's story, but the synthetic oil plants also came within range, along with the railway networks used for distribution. The Allied plan to bomb these resources, Operation Tidal Wave, actually came into being in August 1943, with a large-scale raid on Ploiești, Romania, by American bombers from airfields in Libya. It was not very successful. In fact, it turned out to be one of the costliest missions of the war, with 53 aircraft and 660 airmen lost. The disruption to oil production was said to be minimal. 8 months later, however, it was a different story. The flight time from Italy was half that from Libya, and the bombers were supported by P-51 Mustangs. The Ploiești refineries were, however, protected by considerable amounts of artillery and also fighter squadrons. Ultimately, though, much of the infrastructure was destroyed. The Luftwaffe ran out of fighter planes, and the Romanians gave up on the defense. Shortly after, the regime collapsed. Romania switched sides to become an ally of the Russians, and Antonescu, the Romanian leader, was arrested, tried for war crimes, and executed in June 1946. Ploiești wasn't the only synthetic oil plant supplying the Third Reich, though. Apart from a major facility near to Vienna, there was a large complex at Brux in Czechoslovakia, and this is where we meet Carl. Second Lieutenant Carl Keith Gibson was born in Middlesbrough, Kentucky on the 15th of June 1917. His parents were Matt and Julia Gibson, and he was the youngest of 5 children, with a brother and 3 sisters. His grandfather owned some land nearby, and he likely grew up in the backwoods, most likely with limited education and prospects. However, we do know that he attended high school in Middlesbrough for 4 years, and in the small amount of documentation available, is variously described as an electrician, a salesman, and self-employed. He was therefore probably ambitious and determined to make something of himself. And anyway, Carl wasn't the only local boy from the town who made good. Lee Majors, who became famous for playing the $6 Million Man, and probably even more so for marrying Farrah Fawcett, also attended Middlesbrough High School. Even the high school made news back in 1920 when one of the students, Adolphus Oakes, shot the principal, apparently for beating Oakes' younger sister. At the age of 23, Carl volunteered for the Army Air Corps. On the form, the address he gave was that of one of his sisters, Thelma, and his brother-in-law, W.O. Webb, in RJ, near to Middlesbrough. His misspelt middle name might give a clue as to his education level, but that could be very wrong, since during the selection process he was chosen for pilot training, and that required a high-level aptitude test that most didn't pass, leaving them to train as gunners, wireless operators, and navigators. As further evidence of his perseverance, it was said that even though he found the training hard, he qualified as a first-class cadet on the 17th of April 1943, completed pilot training on the 14th of April 1944, and entered active service on the 15th. He then spent time at various air bases in the US before leaving for Europe on the 24th of October 1944. Apart from that, all we know is that he was 180 centimeters tall, the maximum permitted height for aircrew at that time, and he had grey eyes. Carl joined the 762nd Squadron of the 460th Bomb Group, which in turn was part of the 15th Air Force. He was posted to Spinazzola Army Air Base, which was by then a little more civilized and comfortable than its beginnings in February 1944, when it was just a sea of mud. The warm, dry summer had helped, and this, coupled with the ingenuity of the airmen in finding construction materials and even pooling their own money to hire local builders, had made a great improvement. Even mess halls and other facilities started to appear. The first mission flown by the bomb group was on the 19th of March 1944, and some operational failures here led to more intense training. By late spring, the 460th had become one of the leading groups in the 15th Air Force. Over the next 13 months, they flew 207 missions to Germany, France, Austria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Greece, and Italy. Key target areas were the synthetic fuel refineries, chemical works, aircraft factories, and railway marshalling yards. One major problem with many of those missions was that the Germans were using prisoners of war, concentration camp inmates, and locals as slave labor, so collateral deaths were unavoidable, and that was when the bombs actually managed to find their targets. Second Lieutenant Carl Gibson was the pilot of one of many B-24 Liberators based at Spinazzola, with 760, 761, 762 and 763 squadrons. His ship, as they were referred to, was nicknamed Betty Jane. Whilst we can't be absolutely sure, it's very possible that Carl is on the right of this photo wearing an officer's cap. Officially, it was plane number 603, and its call sign was White G for George. The 20th of December 1944 started early. Typically, briefings were scheduled for 6:30 a.m., since the Americans flew by day, whereas the RAF bombed by night. Wake-up, often done individually by the squadron's operations clerk, armed only with a torch, was even earlier, and of course breakfast came first. Many aircrew, though, settled for just a coffee on operation days, rather than risk throwing up their breakfast into the mandatory oxygen mask. At the briefing, starting with prayers by the chaplain, the operations or intelligence officer would literally reveal the target by throwing off the cloth covering the map. Timings, rendezvous points with the rest of the group, the bomb run initial point known as the IP, anticipated resistance, and weather forecasts were all covered. Alternative targets were also identified, should it not be possible to reach or find the primary one. Today's target will be the synthetic oil refinery near to Brooks in Czechoslovakia. There were 25 aircraft scheduled for the mission from 762 and 763 squadrons. The sortie would be led by Major William N. James Jr., the CO of the 763rd. Crews were taken by truck to their aircraft, where they put on their flight gear. This was quite an undertaking, since it comprised a stiff leather fleece-lined jacket, trousers, boots, inner and outer gloves, and a helmet. Then there was the Mae West flotation device, and finally the parachute harness. A smart airman would always check that the fixings on the harness and the parachute were compatible. Later on, they were color-coded just to be sure. Finally, they would grab their steel helmets. Takeoff began at 0830 with green flares at 30-second intervals to ensure that there were no crashes due to turbulence from the propellers of the preceding aircraft. The Liberators rendezvoused with the 485th Bomber Group over the Adriatic at 0950. They were escorted by 30 P-38 Lightnings and 40 P-51 Mustangs. Already, 5 of the Liberators had to return to base due to technical problems. Just under 3 hours later, at 12:45, Carl and Betty Jane reached the drop zone. The bombing here needed to be highly accurate due to the number of POW camps in the area. They were therefore over the target for longer than they would have liked, and when they eventually could release their load, most of the bombs fell far from the refinery. The target was well protected with artillery, and 8 bombers were damaged by the heavy flak. Ultimately, 13 planes landed safely back at Spinazzola. 5 landed at other Allied airfields, and only 1 failed to make it back. That one was Betty Jane, 603 White G for George, flown by Carl Gibson. The CO, Major William James, radioed Carl and asked what the problem was. He replied that the controls and engines 3 and 4 were shot out and he would be unable to make it to the safety of Yugoslavia. Since he didn't want to ditch on German territory in occupied Europe and have himself and the crew end up in a POW camp, he was going for any Allied territory he could find. Aside from the problems with the controls and the engines, Betty Jane was also getting low on fuel. By 1600 hours, that's 3¼ hours since they took the hit, the fuel finally ran out over the island of Mohacs in southern Hungary. But they were in luck. This put them behind the Russian lines and therefore in Allied territory. Second Lieutenant Gibson stayed at the controls and ordered the crew to bail out. Another crew member also stayed behind to check that everyone was clear, then jumped. As he was descending, he saw Carl also jump and that his parachute opened safely. The out-of-control Liberator then veered to the left and crashed a short distance away. All the crew were rescued either by Russian patrols or the local people. All the crew, that is, except for Second Lieutenant Carl Gibson. For what happened to him, we need to turn to an eyewitness, Kotelin Shirok.
I was almost 15 years old, and that was a very memorable day for me. It was cold, and the soil was frozen. A plane appeared over the farms near Homorud. We saw that parachutists had left the plane. About 1.5 kilometers from our home, there was a willowy woodland called Rona land, which was the property of a Jewish doctor called Deju Rona. This is where 7 of the parachutists landed. My grandmother told me, "Koti, run there and find out their nationality." As I was running, I saw another airman bail out. And since he was about to land where I was standing, I waited. He landed approximately 350 meters from our house, about 100 meters from the gravel road on the right-hand side. As he reached the ground, I was already there. As soon as he landed, he released his parachute harness. I went to him and he shook my hand and asked me, at least it seemed like a question, "Germansky?" I understood what he wanted to know. He wanted to know if he was in Germany. I thought for a moment and replied, "Hungary, Hungary." Then he relaxed. He was approximately 170 centimeters tall with a brown oblong face. He was very happy when he knew that he was in Hungary and not Germany. He sat on the ground and took off the parachute and a backpack, from which he took out a pair of shoes. He was wearing special big boots, which he took off. Then he started to put on the shoes he had taken out from his backpack. They were a pair of yellow leather brogues. By that time, about 30 local people had arrived at the scene. The airman pointed, indicating to the people that they could take his parachute. Then 2 men approached, riding on horses, from the field on the right-hand side. They wore a mixture of civilian and military clothes. They were Russians. We called them skulks, which was a local term for deserters. They had left their units and were scrounging in the countryside. They had just come from a local family who were winemakers, where they got very drunk. It seemed that this family had been sheltering them. As soon as they arrived, they began harassing and insulting the airmen, shouting, "Niemiecki, Niemiecki," meaning German, "gun, document." The pilot replied desperately, "American, American," but they continued to rough him up and repeated, "Niemiecki, Niemiecki," demanding his gun and papers. He showed that he had no gun, but he took a logbook from his pocket and gave it to them. But they didn't even look at it. Not that they would have been able to read it anyway. They threw it about 10 meters away and the papers were scattered everywhere. Also there was a Hungarian former soldier whose rank was Zászlós, or ensign. He'd already been discharged because the war had moved on to the western part of the country. Since the two Russians shouted repeatedly that the airman was German, my mother walked up to this ex-soldier and asked him, "Feri, is it true that the man is German?" And he nodded and replied, "For certain, he is." By that time, the poor airman had already realized that he was in trouble, and he begged in vain not to be hurt, but they wouldn't listen. He raised his hands when they aimed their pistols at him. By now, people had started to move away, and he begged them to come back and not leave him alone. But they realized that something bad was going to happen. The two Russians also shouted to the people, come back, but the mob still kept leaving the scene. Then, one of the Russians stepped forward and shot the pilot in the stomach. I saw as he aimed his pistol. The airman turned around and fell face down on the ground. Then the Russian fired again, this time with one shot at his chest or heart from the back. But that wasn't enough, so he fired another 5 shots at the back of his head. As the poor pilot was dying and writhing, he raised his head, and I saw that his cheekbone protruded and brain tissue was coming out. The two Russians told the people to undress the airman and take his clothes. For them, the most important thing was his watch, so they grabbed it from his wrist immediately. As they were undressing the pilot, they were stunned when they saw the gold star ranks on his uniform. At that moment, they realized for certain that he could not be German. The two deserters left the scene hurriedly and rode to where the rest of the crew had landed. When they got there, they hugged the Americans and welcomed them kindly, calling them our Allied friends. But the Americans were unwilling to return their greetings. They examined the Americans' handguns and tried to exchange them, but they refused. Apparently, one of them had a very special pistol with pearl inlays on its grip. I had an uncle whose name was Ferenc Csóka. He was rather simple and also an alcoholic. The Skolks ordered him to bury the pilot. He waited until everybody had left the scene, then he stripped the pilot naked, saying the underwear would be perfect for him. These were khaki-colored military clothes. He took them home and then returned to dig the grave. That took a long time because the soil was frozen. I was very upset by what I saw. I remember that my mother cooked pastry with cottage cheese for dinner, but I couldn't eat it. I barely slept for weeks. Many times I awoke with a start, and I saw the pilot's face as he was dying with the brain tissue oozing out. I went through that horror again and again. The reminder of this nightmare remained on the frozen earth for weeks. We mourned for him for a long time. There was an old lady who had escaped from a pauper's asylum in Budapest. She found refuge in our house and could speak both English and Russian. When she understood what had happened, she became very upset and asked why they didn't inform her, because she would have been able to interpret for the pilot and the Russians. She spoke both languages fluently. Some hours later, 2 high-ranking Russian officers came from the nearby Soviet headquarters in Shadhat. They weren't looking for the 2 deserters, because at that time they didn't know what had happened. They were looking for the parachutists and the pilot, because they saw from the headquarters that the plane had crashed. Soon, all was revealed, and the 2 officers took my grandma as an eyewitness. They arrested the 2 deserters and marched them off to my uncle's house, the one who buried the pilot. My grandma told me that by that time, the 2 men were in very bad shape. They had been ferociously beaten and had blood coming from their mouths. Because they denied what they had done, the officers hit them with pistols, breaking their teeth. One of them dropped the pilot's wristwatch under a table behind his back. After this, the 2 Russian officers went from house to house and collected the items the locals had taken from the pilot, including his parachute and underwear. The next day, some locals saw the 2 Skolks in Mohács as they were being driven away by car. They said the 2 men were in a very bad state and were beaten so badly that their faces were barely recognizable. I didn't know what happened to them afterwards. While I was waiting for the pilot to land, I watched the plane too. There was a stream next to our farm, and I thought it would crash into it as it descended nose down. My aunt lived on the left bank of the stream, and we lived on the right. As I watched, the plane pulled out from the nosedive, leveled, and flew straight towards my aunt's house. I said to myself, "My God, the plane will hit and destroy my aunt's home." Then it passed over the roof, missing it by just half a meter. One of the engines was on fire and belching smoke. Fortunately, the roof was covered with tiles and not thatch, so it didn't catch fire. The plane hit the ground next to the Kernia farm and skidded for 800 meters, parallel with the gravel road, until the bend. There, the wing struck the road. The plane started to disintegrate, veering to the other side of the road, and the debris scattered over about 200 meters. One of the engines buried itself so deep into the ground that only half a meter of one of the propeller blades could be seen above the surface. It is interesting that no wreckage was on the road. Many useful items were found on the plane: fishing gear, clothes, and radios. There were some blankets. These were grabbed by the family where the 2 Russian deserters had stayed. I remember they also had a shop and a pub. The locals took almost everything over the next few years. Only the engine remained. That was buried so deep that nobody could remove it. Even the owner of the land had to go around it when he plowed. Finally, somebody pulled it out with a tractor. When collective farms were established, those parts that remained were taken away. I don't know where to. The remaining 8 crew members spent that night in Ronaland. There were some buildings on the farmland, and many of the families living there were farm laborers. The airmen were accommodated with one of these. The head of the family was an old man who spoke perfect German, so the crew were able to communicate with him. One crew member had landed a little way away from the others, breaking his thigh bone. The next day, I saw them as they were being escorted along the gravel road. The one with the broken thigh bone was riding on a cart, and the rest were walking beside it. They were around 20 years old, tall, brownish young men. As they were walking on the road, they would have been able to see the wreckage of their plane, but not Carl's grave, which was flat earth at that time. From here, they were taken to Mohács. Later, somebody put a large stone on the grave. I don't remember who did it. Perhaps it was my uncle, who buried him, or maybe the owner of the land, who didn't want his horse treading on the grave. There was just that stone, no cross. Around 1945 and 1946, people came from Budapest bringing items such as clothes to swap for food and other goods. One of them was an old Jewish man named Sándor. He spent his time with local families. He had brought a lot of goods, so he stayed with them for quite a while. One day, the story of the plane and its pilots came up in conversation. At that time, my uncle was still alive, so Sándor asked him to point out the place where the pilot was buried. He then went out to the grave, made a sepulchral mound, and planted some flowers on it. He looked after the tomb and watered the plants each day during his stay. Before he returned home, Sándor promised that he would inform the Americans in Budapest and he would have the body taken from there. If I remember well, it was the summer of 1947. I think he kept his promise because one day, a tall, blonde young man arrived, whose mother tongue was Hungarian. He said he was a former English pilot and worked at the embassy as an interpreter. He came to investigate and tried to find the number of the plane. He was looking for items kept by locals in the hope of finding the aircraft number. He said that he had to find the number in order to identify the crew. Finally, he found some damaged wireless equipment at my grandfather's house. He took it apart, then repaired it crudely, and, in the process, said he had found the number. Some months later, around autumn, the grave registration group and doctors came with a hearse and they exhumed the body. At that time, I was not at home. I was in Bad Monostor. I was sorry I could not attend. When I got back, I was told the body had been taken. The officers interrogated my grandmama again. Also, he said that they already knew who the crew were, but he didn't tell us the pilot's name. The officer said if the crew had known that the 2 Russians had murdered their pilot, they would have killed them on the spot.
The records kept by the Hungarian authorities certainly seem to support Katalin's recollections. This is Katalin in 1997, showing Garbon Nods, the gravesite. They even left some flowers to mark the spot. Garbor's diligent research is the reason we can tell this story in such detail. Based on this, he was able to plot the last moments of the Liberator and the landing places of the crewmen. Point 1 shows the flight path of the bomber when most of the crew bailed out. Point 2 shows where at least 6 of them landed. Point 3 is where Carl Gibson touched down and where he was shot. At 4 we have where the plane came to its final resting place. Point 5 is the approach, since by this time the plane was flying on empty with the pilot no longer at the controls. This is where Cutterlin thought that it would crash either into her house or that of her aunt. And 6 and 7 show where the plane skidded across the field before crossing the road. So what happened to the rest of Carl Gibson's crew from White G for George? Flying Officer Roy R. Adelot, the navigator and bomb aimer, was 23 years old at the time. He landed in a marsh and was initially picked up by a Hungarian farmer. He was later collected by Russian soldiers and taken the 2 miles to their headquarters. After being made comfortable and fed, he spent the night there, and in the morning he was transported by cart to Mohacs, where he met the others. These were the co-pilots, Second Lieutenant Robert E. Curran, 19 years old, Corporal Rufus W. Frith, the flight engineer, aged 26, Corporal Kenneth E. Tyson, the radio operator, aged 28, Corporal James C. Fry, the assistant flight engineer and gunner, Corporal Melvin Levine, the nose gunner, Corporal William M. Stacey, the armourer gunner, and Corporal Norman J. Husband, the tail gunner, were all 19 years old. They had also been picked up by Hungarians and had met 2 Russian dispatch riders who rode off to inform HQ. After spending the night with a Hungarian family, a Russian captain took them to Mohacs too. They were then transported to a small village and reached Bucharest, Romania by train and truck. They were eventually evacuated back to Bari, the headquarters of the 460th Bomb Group, on the 18th of January 1945. After debriefing and some medical treatment, they returned to 762 Squadron at Spinazzola. A month had passed since they took off on their mission. They mostly managed to fly together again, although there were some substitutions. Roy Adelot was replaced by Ben Harrison, and James Fry was replaced by Richard M. Ten. Only one, now Staff Sergeant William M. Stacey, did not survive the war. On the 22nd of March 1945, while on a mission to bomb the railway marshalling yards at Stadlo, Austria, the B-24 was hit 3 times by flak. The pilot, Lieutenant Bullis J. Holman, gave the order to bail out. Stacey was the ball turret gunner on this flight, and it wasn't easy for him to extricate himself from the small space. He managed eventually to sit on the floor, but he wasn't wearing his parachute. The last crew member to jump saw him still sitting on the floor, and as the plane fell into a spin, the G-forces pinned him down and he could not escape. The others were captured immediately on landing and spent the last few months of the war as prisoners. Following the exhumation from his grave near Mohacs, Second Lieutenant Carl Keith Gibson was buried as an unknown on the 28th of October 1946 at the American War Cemetery in Saint-Avold, France. It wasn't until the 19th of September 1947 that enough evidence was obtained to confirm Carl's identity. And on the 19th of March 1948, his body was again exhumed, dressed in uniform, and placed in a coffin with a mattress cover. Carl was interred in his final resting place at the Lorraine American War Cemetery in Saint-Avold on the 13th of December 1948, and on the 15th, the flag that covered his coffin was sent to his parents in Gibson Station near to Middlesbrough, Kentucky. We honor him.